It's that time again when our kids are graduating, extracurriculars are wrapping up, and it seems as though everything is reminding us of what progress, or lack thereof, our child has made over the past year. Today, we discuss the highs and lows of end of school celebrations, how grief can often sneak up on you unexpectedly, and the importance of embracing beauty in the unconventional. Before we get started, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for reminders of upcoming streams. Let's get started. Hi, Embracers!
Welcome back.
Before we start, make sure to visit autismwish.org and click on the Wonderful Wagon fundraiser link for a chance to win a green VW4 Wonderful Wagon, courtesy of DME provider Babies on Broadway, while helping support our autism programs. Just $1 will get you an entry, and it will go so far into helping us with our mission. The winner will be drawn once we reach our fundraising goal, so please consider giving today. And this topic is something that I have been personally struggling with a little bit this past week or two because our girls are now graduating. We just had a pre-K graduation. We just had a kindergarten graduation. My heart has been melting. I don't know about you, Matt.
I'm happy that you added in the clarification that because you started off with our kids have just graduated. And it's like, well, like they're not getting
school.
Well, yeah, they're not getting jobs yet. Like, I mean, let's scale it back. It was a preschool graduation and a kindergarten graduation. So they still have a lot of school and like childhood and all that to come. But yes, it was the like changing where I don't know, like they're becoming bigger than we're like used to because I still think of them as like little babies, little kids. So
I feel like that's honestly harder than like a college graduation. I mean, I'm sure I will regret saying that in the future, but right now it is because this is for us in our state of life, the moment where our kids are no longer like babies, basically. Like now they're big kids and they're going to school and they're starting to do big kid things. So that's been a bit of a transition for us. But I think what happened that kind of hit home a little bit for me is that this year we had those little end of year, what do you call it, like a little performance or something that they do, like a celebration.
I think they call it like an award ceremony, but there wasn't really like awards.
There was no awards,
so it was just like a ceremony at best.
It's like when the kids learn like songs and dances and stuff to perform for their families at the end of the year. I don't know what you would call that. But this was, the first time both of our girls were doing this. Last year, our oldest did. And boy, did she give a show last year.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
But this year it was a little bit harder because we had to go to two of them and they were like back to back. And the thing that's kind of bittersweet is when we went to those, for me at least, I found it to be really nice to see how my kids' teachers were treating them. So both of them very clearly had disabilities. Like you could tell just because of the sheer contrast between them and their classmates. And that was kind of where you get that bitter part of the bittersweet, because I did feel some kind of emotional because I felt like, wow, my kids really stand out. And I don't really take that personally. Like it's not something that bothers me, but I just think about like my experience growing up and being conscious of feeling different from my peers. And the bitter part of that for me has been now we're getting the kids at an age where they become more self-aware. They start noticing these differences. They start noticing when other kids are noticing that they're different. And that was kind of like an aha moment for me when I saw them performing their songs, and I saw how they were both off to the side, like completely all the way at the end at the stage, for obvious reasons, because they couldn't really sit still. The older one did better this year than last year, because last year she went out and greeted the audience and everything. She was wild.
She was the show.
She was the star of that show.
Was the show.
And this year, the youngest was the one that I felt was like really struggling. They had her off to the side, and she has a lot of behavioral challenges too, so she can't really keep still or anything like that, which is fine. But again, she stands out. And I just started thinking about it during their performances. And I just started thinking about like, this is the beginning for us. I feel like this is the beginning of our journey of really advocating for our kids, because pre-K and kindergarten, that's kind of like easier. People are more understanding. But I feel like, first grade and up, I think that we're going to get less empathy and less understanding. And I think that that's really where the real battle's going to start.
Sure. So I feel like so I mean, our older one, I feel like she did she didn't run in the crowd this time. She stayed with her class. Um, but overall, I think her behavior and actions were not bad. I mean, she was doing like the singing and dancing. I mean, she'd get distracted quite a lot and like look for us and like wave. But like she's a kindergartner. But I think at the same time, as a parent, we're also kind of slightly responsible. Essentially, like she's getting excited because we're there. So like it is kind of like our responsibility to show our enthusiasm for her performance. So, and I mean that's true of the youngest one. I mean as well, and that's just kind of the role that I feel like we kind of play a little bit. So like as our youngest is kind of like doing like silly things, silly actions that is not kind of what the rest of the class is. To some extent, I think she's like kind of almost like seeking, I don't want to, I'm not sure if it's like approval or like seeking like, look, I'm like performing, and she like wants like feedback, if that makes sense. Or that's
She
like how
wants
I'm
us to kind of
like be
validate her
happy.
in a sense.
Right. So I mean, or that's like my like inner thought as I'm like seeing her. I'm like, okay, so she might want us to be like excited that she's like doing some like crazy dance move that technically isn't like, I mean, they're supposed to be dancing along with the songs, but she's like doing like crazy dance moves, and like we're like kind of like getting excited and being like giving her like thumbs up, like doing a good job. So I feel like, I don't know, it's kind of an interesting, I don't know, thought that is going through my head with that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that for me, I keep going back and forth with the emotions. Like I remember going and watching them perform, and part of me was just like so happy because I was like, "Oh my gosh, look, they're actually participating. Like they're actually wanting to be with their peers and be a part of this." And like the younger one, for example, she had choreography that had to go along with like the songs, and she was actually doing the choreography. I mean, boy, was she doing them.
Yeah, she was going above and beyond because I was looking at the rest of the classmates and they're like kind of like going through the motions,
Oh, she
and
was very
she
enthusiastic
was
with
like,
hers.
nope, this is like my jam. I am going all in. But I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of cute. I mean, I was excited just seeing how excited she was for it.
Yeah, so like they stood out, but they like stood out in a way that for me I think is like endearing. I know other people might not perceive it that way, but I personally think it's cute and endearing. But at the same time, it was kind of like a reminder of like these differences and what I feel like would be potential future challenges. And I know how it's been so challenging for me growing up as an adult now to create and maintain social relationships. So I know I'm just like projecting my own life experience onto them. And I know like as parents, that's something that we tend to do is we tend to project our own anxieties onto our children. So my hope is that this is literally all in my head and it'll go swell. But that is something that I do think about.
Well, I think also, I mean, improvements based on the individual kids. So if I'm thinking about like our oldest from last year, where they were doing her class was doing songs and singing, and she was kind of like running through the crowd, talking to the audience, like everyone that she could find because she hadn't found us yet, versus this year where she was staying with her class, and of course she was like excited to see us and wanted to constantly like wave at us to show us like, oh, I'm over here, like I see you, kind of thing. But I would even say like that is a huge stepping stone. Like, I mean, there were still, I mean, a few like awkward or like quirky like moments during the performance, but overall I think there was, I mean, drastic changes from kind of how overly excited she was last year, where she wanted to be everywhere, where now she was able to kind of like reel it in a little bit, and she was still excited but was able to be excited in her own space. So I'm curious to see, honestly, next year for our youngest, when she has her kindergarten graduation, how will that transfer, because she seems like she's much more hyperactive as far as like wanting to like run around and everything. So it'll be interesting to see how she transitions next year after like one more year of maturing a little bit.
Yeah, and one of the things that we also put our kids in is this like special needs ballet program. And so that was also coming to an end. So they also had their ballet recital. And so we went to watch their ballet recital program. thank God that they have a one-on-one buddy for this because
Two
I
on
mean,
one,
we
a
kind of
three
knew
on
we
one.
were going to be in for a treat because Matt had gone to the rehearsal and that did not go well. We basically found out that our youngest tends to enjoy, what's it called? Crowd surfing. Like
Yeah,
she
like
likes to try to run
right.
and jump off of the stage. And so there was moments during the recital that she was trying to run off the stage, and there was one moment during the recital where she actually broke free from her buddy and ran and made it all the way to the edge before they noticed, and they darted and grabbed her just at the right second. But we almost had a kid fly off the stage.
Yeah, so but even so, like they were very very excited to be part of that, and I think that was, I mean, not part of the problem, but part of the like challenge because they're so excited to be there. But then as far as like clearly like the safety measures, where jumping
Yeah.
off of like a 4.5 5 foot stage probably
Into a
wouldn't have,
crowd
right,
of people.
probably wouldn't have ended well. But like she was like so excited that like she was performing and like with like her or her older sister. um but yeah, I definitely think that the being able to kind of like stay focused and like in one space is definitely the challenge that we're kind of seeing. I mean, in both like the graduate or ceremony for school versus like the little ballet recital. Because yeah, they definitely had some challenges there. Where I mean, then it was kind of becoming more of a safety issue there.
Yeah, that was a emotional moment for me because when she was really fighting to like get off that stage, and my other one did better during the actual recital, but during rehearsal she was also just kind of going crazy all over the place. It seemed like they were having like a sensory overload, but like more on the excitement side, so they weren't overwhelmed in a negative way. It was like a positive overwhelm, but because of that they get really dysregulated and they kind of get a little bit chaotic. And for me, when I saw that at the recital, it it kind of affected me a little bit emotionally. I got a bit like sad, and I had one of those moments of like a flashback to that grief that we experienced the first day that we got their diagnosis, because it kind of hit home of like, oh, there it is. There it is. There's that danger that we were concerned about. There's that like part of autism that we were first worried about when we first heard the diagnosis. And I feel like we are often really positive and really optimistic, and that usually is really how we feel. But there's moments in time where even if you have it all figured out, even if you are really optimistic, even if you are learning to truly embrace autism, there's still these moments that happen that will catch you off guard, where you will feel that brief second of grief again. And it all comes back to you. And it's like you remember again what it's like to feel it. And that's what happened to me for that moment. I felt grief all over again because everything kind of hit me at once. And I kind of remembered, like, oh, yeah, I forgot. I forgot my kid was special needs. Like, I forgot, because we're so good at embracing their disability that sometimes I genuinely just forget that they have a disability. And so, like, for that moment, it was very obvious that they did. And I think that that kind of made all those old feelings come back. And of course, like, I was able to like process through those real quickly, and it only lasted very briefly. And then afterwards, I was so proud of them for their performance. But it made me realize, like, you're never really truly over grief. It's more like you learn to deal with it and you learn to process it in a healthy way, and you learn to not let it overwhelm you or take over your life. So that's what I've been learning to do basically. And so I still feel very optimistic and positive about the outlook for my kids. But I am now comfortable with the idea that, there's going to be these moments. And I feel like that's totally natural. And I think that that's something that each parent should just expect.
Well, it's hard too because it kind of goes a little bit like kind of with the like shock factor. So like obviously like when we got the diagnosis, that was like a shock because we're like, oh, like what do we do? We don't know anything about autism. And then we had like started to learn more and more and more. And I mean, just through the years we've built up accommodations to help them with just life in general. So now a lot of it seems like it's kind of like secondhand nature. Like whenever we go to a parking lot, like I make sure they are like on my hip. I am holding like a hand. I'm not chancing like, oh, just stand there and I'll like after I get your sister, I'll be there in a sec. Like I am making sure like they are safe the entire time. So I feel like when you build up so many accommodations and then after a while you're like, oh, we haven't really had any like major like incident, you kind of forget like, well, because so many accommodations are in place, if they're in the real world where they're not necessarily with like the same people who like I mean like us that builds those accommodations, it's much more apparent of some of the challenges that they have because they are still there under the surface. It's just we've made the accommodations to basically almost like accommodate accommodate for that so it doesn't like pop up. So when the accommodations are removed, then we're seeing more elements of like, oh yes, they still do try and elope. They still do try and apparently jump off the stage. Spatial awareness is still a worrisome fear now. Because we had always built in accommodations for like spatial awareness, knowing your surroundings and how the terrain differs if you're on playgrounds, that we kind of felt almost a sense of security of sorts because we've built up those accommodations. But then as soon as those are gone, obviously it becomes more apparent of like, oh no, okay, those are definitely still things that we need to like be aware of that they're not gone, they're just dormant.
Yeah, if anything, I think what that experience has kind of reminded me of is that we can't get lulled into a false sense of security. And I mean, there might be things that our kids fully do overcome at some point. And I mean, that's amazing. That's great. I know that our oldest overcame a lot of like feeding challenges, for example, the potty training, things like that, that we have mostly or fully overcome. But there's some things that I feel like are so potentially dangerous or risky that I don't really feel comfortable ever saying we've 100% overcome it because that one moment you let your guard down is the moment that something could happen. And to me, those are the things like elopement. We've had some strange pica moments where like we haven't seen pica activity for like a year and then out of nowhere our oldest will start shoving inedible things in her mouth again, or the youngest too, where she'll just randomly put stuff in her mouth and we don't know what it is. We got to dig it out and then we find out she has like a rock or a bead or something like that. So it's almost like I'm learning to adapt where I can feel comfortable enough to feel okay in the situation and not feel anxious all the time, but still feel like I have to be aware and kind of ready to jump in when necessary.
I would say one of the challenges though is you kind of have to ignore the noise a little bit. And what I mean by that is so many times people are kind of saying like, oh, like they're 5 and 6 now. You don't need to worry about that. Oh, we haven't really seen any type of like elopement concern while we've been watching them. I think you're just an overprotective parent. And you just are constantly getting bombarded with people doing a quick analysis of the short time that they've spent with them. And they're like, well, we haven't seen any of that. We think that must just be a phase that they've grown out of. So if you take that advice completely, then you might be caught off guard when I mean something a little bit more serious takes place because you thought that oh it might have been a baby phase when they were little and now since I mean they're 6 it's no longer a concern until it's a concern. So I mean I feel like that's a thing I keep reminding myself that even though a neighbor, friend, relative might make a quick observation like, oh, I don't think you need to really worry about that. I think you're just being an overprotective parent and you're coddling them too much or you're a helicopter parent or whatever it is. I mean, I would still kind of trust your gut a little bit and kind of be like, okay, well, I'll take that into consideration and I'll kind of observe, but I'm still have that in the back of my mind that if I need to jump in because of an emergency, I'm ready because I haven't written it off as completely gone away.
Yeah, and I do feel like I've personally fallen into that trap of the false sense of security. Because, like, for example, this year, our kids had like a fun run and a field day at the end of the year as well. And we talked about in our field day episode from last year that our oldest had had like 8 elopement incidences where they lost her on the field during her field day. And so this year I was very much like prepared for that. And I let the teachers know and all this stuff just in case. And it actually went really well. Like she did not try to elope this time around. It actually went really well. And so I kind of thought to myself, like, oh, you know what? Maybe she's, over this. Maybe she's not elopement risk anymore. But then I realized, well, it was different from this year than last year's field day. And I realized that the field that she was in this year was completely fenced in. So that kind of makes a difference. And I feel like that might be why we didn't see as much elopement behavior. And it's also, something that I can feel secure about. If it is fenced in, then I don't have to have that sort of stress or worry. So I think that that's something that I kind of caught myself because I think I do need to be worried about the elopement because, again, after that event, we saw the elopement happening during her ballet recital. So we know that it's still there. It's just kind of circumstantial. So that's been something that we've been trying to work on figuring out and something that has been really hard to communicate with other people who don't see our kids on a day-to-day basis.
Right. And I mean, the same thing with the little one with the open field with no fence. She, had like a bouncy ball and she started like heading towards the
Oh,
woods.
yeah, she did elope. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so our
So
youngest one eloped in the same field day that our other one did the previous year
she
on the
just
same field.
she just needed a better mode of transportation. So she was taking the bouncy ball with her.
Oh, it was so funny. So they were doing a bunch of like these centers where there's activities at each center. Most of them were water centers and she hates water. So we
Yeah.
didn't do like 90% of them. But one of them was one of those like hoppity bouncy balls. And it's a race and they're supposed to race across and around a cone and back. And she basically just started racing and then took a sharp left and then just bounced all the way away from the activity center. And we had to go and like chase her down and bring her back. But it was funny because it was like on a bouncy ball. So it just looked hysterical, her like eloping on this bouncy ball.
Like a little like Grand Theft Auto moment on the bouncy ball.
Yeah, I
So,
just thought
oh
that
my
was
gosh.
funny. I forgot about that because it was just too funny.
Well, I figured because it was the exact same field that the oldest one had eloped, and it was the same field that the oldest one had eloped, and then now she kind of does a similar action as far as elopement, just a little bit different and slightly more entertaining with the bouncy
Yeah.
ball. But
And that's kind of like what we mean when we talk about like embracing the beauty and the unconventional. It's kind of like trying to find the silver lining to that cloud. And to me, it is like these moments of the humor in her bouncing away. It's funny because we got her. So she's safe. She's fine. If that was a different story, it wouldn't be funny. But it's just funny for us in retrospect to be like, oh, look, she hopped away in a little ball. And that helps with the stress part of it if you can see humor. It's the same thing with like the ballet recital. It wasn't funny at the moment because I really thought she was about to make it off the stage and she almost did. She was on the edge of that stage. But afterwards, now we make all these jokes about her wanting to go crowd surfing and being a rock star. And, it's
right,
just, it's the way that we cope.
right, and I was gonna say, I mean, obviously, like since the risk and since no one got hurt or anything like that, I mean, yeah, you can constantly be like worked up, like, oh my gosh, like so many things could have happened, like with her bouncy ball while she was making her a run for it. But at the same time, like nothing happened. Okay, she probably got like an extra, like, what, 20, 30 feet away in the opposite direction of where she was going. So, like, yeah, like it would have been great, like if she turned around and gone back. But like at the end of the day, like, okay, she made a wrong turn and kept going. Like, we're aware of like the elopement challenges that she has, but as long as like nothing happens, I mean, we're okay.
Yeah. And I have felt that the end of this year with all the celebrations going on in school and their dance and swim and all of these things that they've been doing that have been wrapped up in the last couple weeks, I have really learned about the waves of emotions that come with autism because there have been so many highs in seeing what they've accomplished in the last year and like how far they've come from the previous year when it comes to certain I guess you would call them developmental milestones and just the things that I've seen them do now that they couldn't do before. And that has been amazing to see. And, it makes us feel really good. I feel really happy about it. But at the same time, I've also seen some regressions. Our youngest has had a lot of regressions since we have had some therapies drop off. And so that has been more stressful for us because, we don't really know when we're going to be able to get therapists again. And we're kind of like on this long wait list that is like months long. And you just never know. Are you even going to get a therapist? Is she going to regress more? And I think that for us, it's been a bit of a journey in the sense that we kind of cycle through these emotions. So we felt grief at the beginning, then we go through this joy, then there's like another moment of grief, then there's joy, then there's grief, then there's joy. And I just want to normalize that. I want everybody out there listening to know that, like, if you're experiencing that, that's totally normal. I personally have felt loss in my family. Like, I lost my dad to brain cancer several years ago. And it honestly feels very similar to that experience where at first you go through this intense grieving period. Then you go through this like recovery phase where you feel like better. You think you can cope fine. And for years you might be fine. And then out of nowhere, something will remind you, whether it's a picture or like an outfit he used to wear or something like that. And that triggers all those emotions and thoughts come flooding back. And then that grief is there again. And I have felt a very similar emotion when it comes to my kid's diagnosis because I feel very comfortable most of the time, but then there will be that one little reminder, like jumping off a stage or something, and it just like triggers that response. It like triggers that memory out of nowhere, and then you just relive all that emotion again. So I just want people out there listening to know and understand, like, Matt and I, despite doing the podcast and despite having this mindset change, we're still human. We still feel these emotions. We still go back and forth between them. It's just that we've developed, I think, a healthy way of coping with them through our humor and through being able to embrace the concept of autism and really become more accepting and accommodating to our girls' needs while also accommodating our own kind of like emotional needs too.
Yeah, I mean, it is a weird experience because you do feel like you kind of get to a comfortable place or state of mind of like, oh, okay, like this is like the day to day kind of things, and then you will occasionally get like the reminder during a ceremony or some type of activity. But yeah, it's because I don't know if it's just like because it's not constantly like in your mindset, like oh, like we're working on this. Um, this concern and it just kind of flares up a little bit. I'm not really sure why, as far as like the cycle through the different series kind of emotions happens. Because I mean, over most of the year, I think like we've been doing pretty well. Like I mean, kind of just chugging along. But then yeah, you get to like some of these milestones, and then sometimes there's like a little bit of a shock factor where it kind of like resets you a little bit, and then you're kind of like okay, like there are still things that we clearly need to kind of like work through and kind of figure out for basically ourselves and like our girls. And it kind of, I find it kind of almost like a like humbling moment of sorts because it's like you're kind of hitting like a reset button where you're kind of like, okay, like let's kind of revisit like, okay, autism, like again, instead of just like using just like a like slogan like okay like autism like got it like no problem, but it kind of like forces you to like reflect on like the characteristics of autism and some of the challenges that they're encountering, and then you can kind of get a better like mindset moving forward from there, I think.
Yeah, I think for us, what it's been is that when you're in a silo, when you are alone at home with your family or your autistic child, you get very used to that life. And so for you, everything is normal. And so when our kids go out in the real world and then we see them next to their peers or we see how they interact during these like performances, celebrations, things like that, then you kind of get a reality check of like, oh, wait, my kids' needs are more severe than I initially thought. We're just coping really well with it. But you don't really realize how different they are until you're out there in the real world. So that's something that we have been working with more now as they're getting older and interacting more with the world. So that's something we'll probably end up talking more about in future episodes. But I want to ask you guys out there, have you run into those sudden waves of grief, or are you sometimes overwhelmed with tears of joy at unexpected success? Let us know in the comments on YouTube or Facebook at Autism Wish, or continue the conversation with us on our private Embracing Autism community. And don't forget to become a member today at autismwish.org for exclusive access to our private Embracing Autism community, where you can help support our mission while finding your tribe. Thanks again for hanging out, and we will see y'all next time.
Bye.
Bye.